Hi, I'm Rahel Philipose and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the US accusing China of using spy balloons against them. We also give you an update on the compensation decided for the Joshimath crisis. But first, we talk about the new artificial intelligence-infused search engine launched by Microsoft Bing. Back in November, a startup called OpenAI launched a revolutionary new AI-powered chatbot called ChatGPT. The bot was trained to engage with a user just like a human would, and you could talk to it about almost anything. You could ask it to make you a diet plan, write an email, or even your college essay. And this became an internet phenomenon, and people used it to ask all kinds of things.
Is diet soda dangerous? I have my own feelings on this. Let's see what Dr. ChatGPT has to say about it.
I asked the AI-powered robot what could be considered the best investing approach for beginner investors.
It turns out AI knows more about love than most people. I asked ChatGPT, what is true love? And here is what it told me.
Now cut to February this year, when Microsoft announced a new AI-powered version of its Bing search engine, which it developed in collaboration with OpenAI. And this engine now promises to be even more powerful than ChatGPT. In this segment, we are joined by the Indian Express's new media editor, Nandagopal Rajan, to talk about how the Bing search engine works and how different it is from ChatGPT. So Nandu, before we talk about Bing AI, since you've had access to it for a few days now, I was wondering if you could ask it something that a lot of hardworking people might find useful. And here I'm running the risk of getting fired myself, but I thought, why not ask the search engine how to ask your boss for a month off without being fired?
Okay, let's try that. Okay, we have asked the question. So the answer is coming. Asking your boss for a month off without getting fired is not an easy task, especially if you don't have a good reason or a plan to cover your work. However, there are some tips that might help you make your request more professional and acceptable. Make a coverage plan for your absence, briefly explain it to your boss. Show that you have thought about how your work will be done while you're away and who will be responsible for it. This will demonstrate that you care about your job and your team. Ask, don't tell. Requesting time off is just that, a request. You should not assume that your boss will automatically approve it, which is very true. And note how many vacation days you have used so far. If you have a lot of unused vacation days, you might have a better chance of getting your request approved. And I think this is very sane advice. As somebody who encounters this on a daily basis, I think it's very sane advice, and this is something people really don't think about when they ask for long leaves.
Okay, now that that's out of the way, can you tell us how Bing AI is different from something like ChatGPT?
Yeah, I've had access to Bing as part of an early release, for the past 2-3 days. So like ChatGPT, which in the past 2 months has sort of become the most popular internet thing ever, that kind of thing. It's outgrown anything that's been out there. Now, Bing, which actually uses a much evolved version of ChatGPT, when people are saying it's GPT-4, and what is available on ChatGPT is actually GPT-3. But if ChatGPT is actually trained on data only till about 2021. So what happened after that is not available. On the Bing search engine, because the power of AI from this GPT language is being yoked with real-time scraped data from a search engine, it suddenly makes ChatGPT look redundant. And in fact, you actually had the CEO of OpenAI, say that ChatGPT is not a great product. And it is maybe with this hindsight of how good it looks and works when you actually incorporate it along with real-time search results.
Right, and could you explain how it's being able to do that? Like, how is it being able to give real-time answers to pretty much any query that you feed into it?
So my understanding is that you have tons and tons of data, literally tons of data, which is being scraped by these language tools. So initially, all this data was scraped for indexing on the internet and all of that. Now, these language tools look at it in a slightly different way. They try and figure out what is the content inside. Now, they add things like knowledge graphs on top of it. So A plus B. And I'll give you an example. One of the searches I did is about myself. Who is Nandagopal Rajan? And the one line that blew my mind is the last line that Bing threw up, saying he also speaks regularly at media and technology events. Now, that one line in itself is not there anywhere, but it has just seen my name being listed at media and technology events as a speaker, and from that created this one line.
So it isn't just picking up some random sentences from different places, it's also trying to make sense of it.
It is adding the context, it is adding an understanding of what this means, which was not there earlier. Now, how does this manifest itself in a product, right? So for instance, an article which I wrote, I asked ChatGPT and then Bing to sort of rewrite the same article. So it immediately rewrites it. It doesn't have anything from the original article. Maybe it is a little bit emotionless compared to what I wrote, but it works. It's perfectly good copy. Now then I ask it again to rewrite it for a certain audience, let's say teenagers. It does that also very well. The same article, it's rewritten it again. It has actually read an article on how to write for teenagers. The learning from there, it is applied on my article, which is written by a 45-year-old. So again, that is mind-blowing stuff. And I remember reading Somerset Maugham as a kid, and he says that if you're a great writer, you can keep on changing your copy. Very few people can actually keep on changing my copy. But think of it, I have written one version, which I think is my version, and I can have maybe 20 different versions for different sets of audiences. I can even ask it to convert it into a movie script if I want, a boring news report. It will do that. So that is where it is going beyond the realm of what technology was able to do, right? So as of now, when I'm using Bing, with every result it's throwing, it gives me a thumbs up and a thumbs down option. So if I'm going to give a thumbs down option to an answer that has come, then it knows it's done something wrong. It needs to be better. So it's again going to look at stuff and get better at what it does.
Okay, so why don't we try something? Let's try and ask some questions that would require a certain amount of context. Can we ask it to explain, say, the significance of Air India's mammoth Airbus order to a teenager?
So I'm asking, explain Air India Airbus order for a teenager. Okay, it will take a couple of seconds. So it shows me I'm searching for Air India Airbus order. I don't know whether it's going to have the teenager element, but let's see. Yeah, so it started writing. Air India is a big airline company in India that flies people and cargo around the world. Recently, Air India decided to buy a lot of new airplanes from Airbus, which is another company that makes airplanes. Air India ordered 250 airplanes, which is a lot of money and a big deal for both companies. So see, it is real time. It's again dumping it down a little, which is I think the teenager angle, because it's telling you about the companies, about why the 250 Airbus aeroplane deal is a big one. And again, Airbus airplanes come in different sizes and shapes. Again, it's written not for somebody who might have the context of a lot of this, so again, so it's done. It's given me 4 paragraphs in about 30 seconds.
And who has it attributed the information to?
So it's taken the data from aerotime.aero, India Today, Airbus, Reuters, and one more source, and it tells me specific parts are attributed. So attribution is also going to become a very important part of how AI works, because AI is not generating anything on its own, right? It's pulling from somewhere, maybe tweaking it, adding context. Without attribution, all of it just becomes plagiarism.
And Nandu, in the future, will websites have the power to say, hey, I don't want you to take my information? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, that is a possibility. I think as this becomes even more an existential crisis for search engines and websites and all of that, these calls will be taken, because without data, AI is not good. And again, if Indian Express has the best reportage on something, on the best reportage on certain events, I would rather keep it to my audience and not let it be, sort of reused and repackaged without benefiting from it. So these calls will be taken, and the earlier idea of letting search engines crawl everything, it was based on the fundamental belief that a lot of those readers will ultimately come to you to figure out the full deal. Now that is maybe not possible. So then I think the business models around this will change.
Okay, and while all of this is pretty exciting, it's also kind of concerning, right? Is there a fear that this technology could potentially make a lot of jobs redundant, particularly jobs in the content generation space?
So what AI does is that it immediately puts the pressure on humans to be better than machines. So if you're only as good as AI, then maybe you're not good enough. You have to be better than AI. And that is not that difficult, right? So if I have asked Bing 10 questions, it's got things wrong 3 or 4 times. So it doesn't have a 100% success rate. It gets a lot of things wrong. It is not able to identify Nandagopal Rajan, who's speaking to you now, from another Nandagopal Rajan, maybe who's a software developer in the United States. Right? It is not able to do that. But a human is able to immediately identify that this one guy is a journalist and the other is a software engineer. So what happens now is that, at least for now, anything that is generated by AI will have to be verified by humans. Maybe gradually we will have the trust in AI that, okay, it has a 95% success rate, so you don't have to. Or you have trained it on data which is already trusted. So for instance, if everything that an Indian Express AI chatbot does is based on Indian Express data, then Indian Express at least does not have to verify it. So we trust our own data. So things like that.
And going forward, how do we see an AI like this being incorporated with the way we use search engines online?
So AI is going to be integrated with everything. Since Microsoft has a stake now in OpenAI, you will see that coming into your Microsoft Word, your Excel sheets. You will not have to apply formulas to figure out something. You will just ask your AI assistant to look at a big data set and tell you or give you the one thing that you want, like a growth over a 10-year period or whatever. And it's going to come in a flash, right? You will not have to figure out what is the formula for this and apply the formula on the Excel sheet. It's going to come to your mail, for instance, right? So right now you have ChatGPT extensions which let you reply to mails that's coming to your inbox. So I would love that, because 80% of the mails that I get are only good enough for an AI response.
And Nandu, how does Bing AI respond to something that is, say, political or something that's subjective in nature?
So a question or something that we constantly discuss within a newsroom, especially in a newsroom like Indian Express, is the fact that our biggest asset is trust, right? In fact, I asked Bing, can you trust Indian Express, right? And the answers I've got so far have been very balanced. And you can ask it about, can you trust a Nandagopal Rajan or a politician, all of that. So let's see how this works. So interestingly, it is searching for, can you trust Indian Express? It's immediately started searching Indian Express credibility. So this is the context, this is the understanding that the search engine has now. It didn't have this earlier, because earlier it will just dumbly search what you had inputted. But now it's done a 1+1, right? So it's giving a history of Indian Express. It's saying Indian Express is having a mixed factual reporting record and a left-center bias in its editorial stance. This means that Indian Express may sometimes publish misleading or false information. On the other hand, some people have praised the Indian Express for its quality and integrity. For example, a service called NewsGuard rates the Indian Express website as a green for its credibility and trustworthiness based on its journalistic standards. This means the Indian Express website follows basic principles of accuracy, transparency, accountability, and fairness in its news. Therefore, whether you can trust Indian Express or not may depend on your own judgment and preferences. I think this is very balanced. It's giving you a part where it says that it might sometimes publish misleading or false information, which interestingly comes from Quora. So this is where I think it has to evolve. How much would you trust a Quora, compared to maybe a media watchdog is what, it needs to learn. But I think these are early days.
Also, Nandu, how come we're seeing a company like Microsoft, which operates Bing, take the lead here, and not someone like, say, Google, which has the biggest search engine?
See, Google has had this technology for a few years now, and even that technology has been evolving. My sense is that, Google did not want to take it live, because the way this is going to manifest itself, or the way I'm seeing it manifest itself in Bing and the other search engines, it's going to actually take away a lot of Google's business. Because if I'm giving a very definitive answer to a query, I don't have any reason to click on a link. And a lot of Google's business is by driving traffic to places where it has ads and that inventory gets monetized. Now, I would think a lot of that use case goes away. Google knows it, which is why it wouldn't want to do it. But now, since Bing has taken the upper hand and bought it out, Google has no option but to launch its version of AI. It's already showcased it. It's called Bard. And that Bard is going to be available along with your Google search again in a few months or weeks. We don't know how much they will allow it to work, because there are going to be issues on how good this technology will be at scale, and will people be able to use it. Because if you see, Bing is only 3% of the world's search engine traffic. Google is about 95%. So it's going to be a much different scale than what Bing will have. And will computing be able to handle that kind of a pressure, right? That is where, and it will be hugely costly. So there will be a lot of considerations before they actually make it live to all the users.
Next, we talk about spy balloons. On the 4th of February, the United States shot down an unidentified object flying in its airspace. This, as it turns out, was a high-altitude flying balloon, which the US said was sent by China for the purpose of surveillance. This sparked a new conflict between the two countries, with China claiming that the balloon was meant for scientific research and flew into the US airspace because of the wind. Since then, the US has shot down 3 more unidentified objects, which they claim have also been spy balloons, but those haven't been recovered yet. Now, to understand what these balloons are and how commonly they are used for surveillance, my colleague Utsa Sarmin speaks to the Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha. Amitabh, could you begin by talking about what these high-altitude balloons are used for?
Right. So the high altitude balloons are just one type of balloons that are used for a wide variety of purposes, mainly for scientific reasons. Right? So these balloons have been used for several decades. In fact, for at least a couple of centuries, they have been in use. But in the last few decades, at least in the previous century, they have been used very frequently. In fact, even in India, we have been using these balloons for, scientific data collection and for research purposes for at least 70 years. And there are lots of other countries that send balloons for different purposes. For example, the Met Department in many countries uses smaller versions of these balloons for data collection on a daily basis. In some countries, balloons are sent up every morning, every evening to collect weather data. These are localized observations that have to be carried out. So these are relatively smaller balloons. These are not very large balloons. These are bigger than the balloons that you see being sold by the street vendors, 2 to 4 times bigger than that, or maybe slightly bigger than those, able to carry, say, maybe up to 4 or 5 kgs of weight that is strung by a string. They go up and they come down some distance away, they are recovered and used again.
Right, so the low-altitude balloons are smaller in size and are generally used for collecting data on the weather. But what about the high-altitude balloons? How different are they in terms of size and use?
So the high altitude balloons, the balloons that are being discussed right now are very different, though there are some similarities, but very different. We are talking about huge balloons, and by huge, I mean balloons much larger than your commercial jetliners, almost the size of some of them, not all, but almost the size of a football stadium. So we are talking about giant balloons. And they usually have sort of a basket that is attached at the bottom. And that basket is called gondola. And these are large baskets. I don't know whether you have been on one of these joyrides on a balloon. I have taken one of these joyrides. And lots of these balloons are also used for joyrides and for tourism purposes. So I've taken one in Paris. It goes a few hundred feet in air. And again, you are made to stand in that gondola, which is bigger than a lift. You can walk around that space. So it's a relatively large space wherein you can place lots of instruments, and they serve lots of purposes for atmospheric sciences experiments, even space experiments, meteorological experiments, lots of things for which these balloons are used and very commonly used. Surveillance balloons are also not very unusual, not unheard of. They are used, although, as I said, none of these balloons have any navigational system, right? So they are completely at the mercy of wind, because of which, controlling them becomes a problem. And that's why they are not as commonly used for surveillance, because you are dependent on the wind. And of course, while it is possible to calculate and predict the wind direction, at least in the polar regions, it's much more reliable to do these calculations. But again, because you are not in control of the balloon, it serves a limited purpose. But in this particular instance, it does seem that a surveillance sort of effort was being carried out by the Chinese balloon.
Okay, so considering that they don't have navigational systems and they're hard to control, what is the reason that countries end up using them?
So the advantages are the fact that, number one, you can have balloons loiter around over an area for a very prolonged period of time. So if you are observing a particular space, a particular location on ground, you can do it for a prolonged period because it's a very slow moving sort of a thing. It spends a considerable amount of time over a particular area, and therefore you can have better observation, better spying if you intend to do that. So that's one advantage. The other thing, of course, is the way our technical systems are configured right now, mainly radars, which detect any foreign flying objects over sovereign airspace. These radars very often, not always, but very often, they mistake these balloons to be birds, mainly because of the slow movement. These radars are attuned to detect fast moving objects like an aircraft, an enemy aircraft over in the airspace. They can detect those fairly easily, but these very slow moving objects like a balloon often get mistakenly identified as birds. So that's another reason why balloons can be sometimes used. And in comparison to, say, a satellite, for example, balloons are also very, very cheap to launch and to use. Satellites sometimes can, cost you millions of dollars. Balloons are much, hundreds of thousands of times cheaper sometimes. Also, the instruments that you send, they are recoverable because the balloon comes down and it's possible to recover those instruments and then reuse them. So unlike in a satellite, most of the satellites don't come back, so you're not able to use them.
Okay, so the fact that they're harder to detect, that they stay in one position for a longer time, and that they're cheaper than satellites. But how commonly are they actually used for surveillance?
So I won't say it's a very common practice to use balloons for surveillance, but it is sometimes used. In earlier decades, it was more common. So it's said that during Second World War and even after that, balloons were much more frequently used for spying purposes. Not so anymore. But this particular incident does show that, countries continue to rely on balloons for these kind of expeditions. There must be some use for them. The United States actually said that there have been other incidents as well earlier of Chinese sending balloons over US airspace, but those had gone undetected at that time. The US got to know of it only later. The Chinese in turn have said that from last year, the US actually sent 10 spy balloons over the Chinese airspace without informing them. So there have been some accusations and counter accusations. Just goes on to show that this practice of using balloons for surveillance is not completely out of fashion, that it is being used, but we do not have a very good idea of how useful the information, how qualitatively good the information collected is. But by the account of both the US and Chinese, it does seem that it's a practice that continues to this day.
Okay, Amitabh, the US has now said that they're developing radars that will be able to detect these slow-moving objects, these spy balloons. But is there a risk that they could confuse a spy balloon with, say, tourists enjoying a hot air balloon ride?
So there are various ways to distinguish that. That won't be very difficult. One, the tourist or the joyride balloons don't operate at very high levels. They are usually moving at around a few hundred feet above the ground. So that's easily distinguishable. Also, if a balloon is going up in the air, it has to be notified. You just can't launch a balloon in air because you have to inform your civil aviation authorities because it affects a few hundred feet above the ground, and in some cases a few thousand feet above the ground. That would require an intimation to the civil aviation authorities because of the possibilities of it coming in the flight paths. So every launch of balloon, when it happens, maybe not the smaller ones, the Met offices, but there are designated areas actually where you can fly these balloons. Even otherwise, and even in those areas, when you are launching a balloon, you have to notify the authorities that at such and such day and such time, there is a balloon that is going to go up in this particular direction for safety considerations. So that won't be very difficult. So you would know where a balloon is flying.
And in the end, we give you an update on the Joshimath crisis. On Wednesday, the Uttarakhand State Cabinet approved the proposed policy regarding compensation which will be given to the families or individuals of the Joshimath area which is affected by the sudden sinking of land. Since the land started sinking, people have had to vacate their homes and commercial buildings, and soon they started demanding compensation from the government. The compensation policy was finally approved this week. According to the policy, the owners of the affected houses in Joshimath can choose one of the three options. The first is to take the entire compensation in the form of money as per the rates decided for their homes and land. Under the second option, the owners can take monetary compensation for their damaged house and the government will provide them land to build a new one. And in the third option, owners can demand a new house from the government, which will be given to them against their land and existing house. The same three options have also been provided to the owners of commercial structures such as shops, hotels, and restaurants. So far, 868 structures in Joshimath town have developed cracks, and out of those, 181 are in the danger zone. In January, ISRO's National Remote Sensing Center released satellite images which showed that Joshimath rapidly sank by 5.4 centimeters in just 12 days between 27 December 2022 and 8 January 2023. Since then, the authorities were looking for a suitable land to permanently relocate the affected families. The process of giving compensation will start soon after the survey of the affected houses and the area is completed, and the same is compiled by the National Disaster Management Authority. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was hosted by me, Rahel Philipose, and produced by me along with Utsa Sarmin and Shashank Bhargava. Today's episode was edited by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also share the show with someone who you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.